compliance with the previous legislation that came into effect after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. It means that the males are supposed to always carry their military registration ID with them and to produce it at the checkpost during border crossing. This procedure covers the following categories of males. Those are the males who were booked during the martial law, then the males who were recognized by the medical commission as those unfit for military service. Also, it covers the males who have 3 or more underage kids, or one whose spouses are in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine, plus other categories of the citizens of Ukraine identified by the Article 23 of the law on mobilization and mobilization preparation. For the time being, we have to understand that we don't additionally check the presence of the military registration ID for the males who are covered by other articles which make them exempt from the imposed restrictions. I mean, disabled people, people who have disabled people, then the males who are transporting the humanitarian aid, the drivers who exercise the international transportation of goods and passengers, as well as representatives of Ukrainian railway. I mean, all those categories of population who are clearly covered by the Ukrainian legislation as those exempt from restrictions. I have to emphasize that we check the existing paper documents, not the electronic ones, and the changes to the legislation, to the law of Ukraine on mobilization, clearly stipulates that identification, whether the people are fit for postponement, are subject to postponement, is the responsibility of the draft centers. And the state bodyguard service are only responsible for inspection of documents and their verification. Do we expect any more changes in the procedures for border crossing by the males? Well, currently, the resolution of the government number 57 was not amended so far. That's why I think it's worth expecting certain changes shortly to standardize all of the procedures resulting from the legislation that came into effect. That may result in certain amendments and changes in procedures for border crossing for certain categories of males. As soon as it becomes known to us, we will disseminate relevant information to the public. Well, so what is the situation for the time being in the border checkposts? Now there is the season of vacations is coming up. Do you observe any increase of the number of the citizens crossing the border lately? Well, lately we were observing the increase of the passenger flow exiting Ukraine. Well, there was a lot of speculations related to the fact that on the 18th of May the changes to the legislation come into effect, but I have to say that such a dynamics is mostly related to the end of Easter holidays, because 2 weeks prior to the Easter the passenger flow was quite intense on the way into Ukraine. Now it's more or less stabilized, and it's at the level of 85,000 persons per day. But currently we don't observe any disbalance I mean, some days there are more people coming into Ukraine, on the other day there are more exiting Ukraine. It's more like 50-50%. And just like earlier, for example, men were allowed to cross the border only if they fall under certain exempt category. And just like earlier, now the fraction of men crossing the border is not prevalent because the principal category of those crossing the border are the females, children, foreigners, and the elderly. Sir, so talking about the situation in the borders with Belarus and Russia, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv regions. Well, in Kharkiv region, the enemy tries to exercise pressure into areas in Vovchansk and Lipsy directions. The state bodyguard serves as a part of the security and defense forces fulfill their tasks in compliance with the concept of the general staff, repelling the attacks shoulder to shoulder with their brothers in arms from other security and defense forces, holding their positions in order to prevent the advance of the enemy forces in Vovchansk axis. In other areas of Kharkiv region, the situation is characterized by everyday shellings inflicted by the enemy. The same situation is in Sumy region. The enemy uses all kinds of weapons, including aviation, from across the border. The majority of shellings happen using artillery and mortars, but the enemy also resorts to using tanks with which they inflict strikes on the borders of Sumy region. There is also activity of sabotage groups who try to enter a territory. We cannot say it happens every day, but there is certain periodicity. A couple of days a week, enemy sabotage groups are being discovered as they attempt to enter our territory. They are being fired at because our warriors understand the threat that may be posed by the use of sabotage groups by the enemy. This is why they do everything that they can to identify them, to detect them, and to inflict damage of them. So did the number of attempts to penetrate a territory by such sabotage groups increase compared, say, to April? Well, they're at the same level as the month before and the month before that. In fact, they don't cease their attempts because if, for example, we recall previous year, the enemy sabotage group started acting most actively in Chernihiv region. Later they switched to Sumy region. There was certain activity in Kharkiv region. But lately, within the latest period, well, starting from the end of the last year and until this very moment, the most active axis of their activity, I mean, where the enemy sabotage groups try to penetrate our territory, is the Sumy region. And again, we have to understand that the length of the border in Sumy region is over 560 kilometers. Thank you very much, dear journalists. Do we have any questions on the floor? Good morning, Tatiana Pasova, Ukrinform. I'm having two questions. You've mentioned that the State Bodyguard Service only let those mails through who have the paper documents and don't accept any electronic documents. Can you please give us more detail on the nature of these paper documents and what is the situation with the students? Are the male students being allowed to cross the border outside Ukraine? Well, talking about any applications that the males use to update their details in the electronic systems are not accepted by the State Bodyguard Service. We only use the paper military registration ID issued by the Territorial Draft Center that has relevant marks on deregistration or postponement of draft. The resolution of the government published by the government on the 17th of May contemplates the availability of the electronic documents, but again, all those applications do not represent the electronic documents themselves. And as soon as the procedure comes into force, when the military registration ID in its electronic forms becomes effective in compliance with the legislation, the State Bodyguard Service will eagerly accept it as soon as it's clearly stipulated by relevant procedures covering the operations of the State Bodyguard Service. Talking about the students, there is very specific category of the students which is exempt from restrictions that was stipulated by the government resolution number 57. Again, it does not cover all the students, but only those who go for study outside Ukraine. Thank you. Do we have any more questions on the floor, please? Good morning, Tatiana Holanova, Expresso TV channel. I'm having three questions, I'm sorry. Can you please tell us whether the border crossing is allowed for the citizens of Ukraine who have the status of refugees in other countries of Europe? That's the first question. Are you talking about males or females? Well, I'm talking about males. Well, in fact, there is no such procedure in the rules for border crossing that would allow such category of people to leave Ukraine multiple times. I mean, those who have the status of refugee outside Ukraine. Thank you. So, how are the bodyguard service supposed to act with those who have either failed to update their details in the territorial draft center or are in the databases as those evading from the draft? Well, we have to inform the draft office to make sure it's not a failure of electronic systems and all of the data is actual, but I have to emphasize that the State Bodyguard Service started implementing the information exchange between the databases of the State Bodyguard Service and the Oberich draft system, so the representatives of the draft centers can use some information from the databases of the State Bodyguard Service, and the State Bodyguard Service may use their Oberich system as an instrument to verify whether the people do not use any counterfeit documents as they cross the border. I mean, those that are supposed to be issued by the territorial draft centers. And the last question, after the law on mobilization has come into force, do you have any statistics of the refusal by the State Bodyguard Service to cross the border for any males? Well, starting from the 18th of May, we check the presence of the military registration ID for certain categories of the males that I've already mentioned, and in relation to those categories there were already refusals because some of the people were not having that military registration ID on them, as well as they did not have any confirmation of postponement. Specifically, I'm talking about the males who have 3 or more underage children, and currently the State Bodyguard Service refuses about 250 males who do not fall under exempt categories on a daily basis. They are not subject to those procedures that makes them exempt, including that category who is supposed to have their military registration ID on them, but unfortunately they do not have. Previously, the State Bodyguard Service was refusing about 150 persons on a daily basis. Do we have any more questions, dear journalists? Thank you. I'm having one more question. lately there is a lot of advertising promoting seasonal works outside Ukraine. Are there any options for the young males to leave for seasonal works, or it's not currently contemplated by the legislation in force? Well, it's not contemplated under conditions like this for seasonal wars, but if the male citizens of Ukraine have any grounds to cross the border, nobody may restrict them with any other conditions to leave Ukraine. Do we have any more questions, please? Good afternoon. Information Agency Journalist Against Corruption, Alexander Homan. Well, for what I understand, nothing has changed. So the male of the conscription age may live under the procedures that were enforced before. So it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Economy who may allow them to leave based on the legal grounds in coordination with the Territorial Draft Center. Am I correct? Well, basically talking about transportation, for example, of humanitarian aid, the resolution of the government has an article that says that the citizens of Ukraine may go outside Ukraine for the purposes of transportation of humanitarian cargo or any cargo to support the armed forces of Ukraine. The information about them should be contained in the Shlach system, along with the issue of the relevant permit that makes them exempt from the restrictions for crossing the border of Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. Andrii. Let me remind you, we were talking about the changes to the rules of border crossing after the implementation of the law on mobilization, and we will be back on air at 1100 talking about rehabilitation of our veterans. Stay tuned.